Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the continuation of our class on fundamentals of Oxford shoe making. In the last class, we created this rather tacky looking Oxford. We designed it on the last, and I did mention to you at that time, I did ask you to pardon the tackiness, pardon the roughness of the design, and I promised that I was going to, add some finesse to it when we design on a flat piece of paper. So that's what we're going to do in this part 2 of the course. We are going to peel out both sides of the last that we taped and then create something that is called a mean form. The reason why we create a mean form is because our design was done on just one side of the last. And if you have taken a look at any last, you would realize, in fact, if you take a look at your feet, you would realize that the inside and outside parts, that is the medial and lateral sides, aren't symmetrical. So there are differences between the two sides of a last and as well as the two sides of your feet that a mean form helps us to factor in. So a mean form is the average of the dimensions of the two sides, which when we now use it to create our design, presents a truer representation of what is similar between the two sides of the last. Right now, on the inside part of the last, the medial side, I'm marking out all of those cardinal points that we generated. Now, I will flip that medial side over. If you noticed, I cut some notches on the cardinal points that we generated in the last class. So I'll flip the medial side, also cut a notch at the ball there. I'll flip the medial side over and trace it out, marking in all of the cardinal points using those notches that I cut in earlier. So that's the van point, that's the ball down there, and then you see the counterpoint. Then I'll place the lateral side on top of the trace out of the medial side, and then match heel to heel and tip to tip, and then also trace out that outside copy of the last. So I'll trace that out, marking all of the cardinal points as well, just as we did when we traced out the medial side. I forgot to add a mark in the instep of the inside part, the medial side, so I'm just adding that in now. Now, to create the mean form means to find the middle where of the differential between the two parts. Now, on the underside is going underneath the last in any case, so there's no need to find the middle between. But on top and in front, like so, I'll find the middle part between the differential of the two. Then also for the van point of the two last copies, I would also find the middle of the vamp line of the two last copies. Then I'll simply just cut out the entire thing, and then this form that you see right here is our mean form. Next, we are going to trace out the mean form on a clean piece of paper and then begin the recreation of our design on that clean piece of paper. Now you see how clean my design lines can be. So I've marked out all of the cardinal points. That's the van point there, that's the ball, that's the instep, and that's the counterpoint. So the first thing I'll do is to draw in the vamp line on this. So I measure the vamp line and mark the middle of it. Then I'll draw my quarter line from the counterpoint to that middle point. I'll add 1 cm to my counterpoint to get my back height. Then I'll draw part of my top line from the back height to where the quarter line starts. Then I'll measure my quarter line, divide it into 2. And then if I draw a line from the instep to that middle point on my quarter line, that's the tongue line. Now remember in class 1 when we found 1/4, 1/5 and 1/8 of our last length, those measurements will come in handy now. The measurement of the tongue is 1/8 of the last length. The last length being 26 cm, 1/8 of it is 3.25 cm. So we mark that in, and then we mark a point about half a centimeter beneath the middle of the vamp line and join the width of the tongue to that point. That point, which is the width of the tongue, gives us a reference from where we can finish off our top line. I mark the same 3.25, 1/8 of the last length on the back height line and use that to draw in the curve. I've also drawn in the curve of the tongue. In class 1, we mentioned that you should start your facing about 1 cm above the vamp point, so that's what we did. We mark 1 cm and draw a right angle from there, and then 1/8 of the last length, 3.25, we mark on that line, which is going to be the width of one side of our facing. Then we find 1/4 of our quarter line and mark that in. That's just dividing half of the quarter line into two. So those 2 points now become the references for curving in the curve of the facing to the quarter line. Next, you know this point where we have the half of the quarter line, we draw a right angle from there, and then from the point of 1/4 of the quarter line, we just curve in the rest of the quarter. So our Oxford is taking shape right now. Let's do the cap toe. I told you the cap toe's measurement is about 1/4 of the last length, which came to 6.5. I added about 5 millimeter to it, drew a right angle from there, and then just used my French curve to curve it in a bit to factor in the curvature of the last. So there you see it, ladies and gentlemen, is my cap toe. Now let's quickly deal with the tongue. I told you that you measure about 1.5 cm on the facing and then draw from the width of the tongue to that point. Then I'll use my French curve to curve in this design line at the side there. And ladies and gentlemen, our Oxford has taken final shape. Let me just go ahead and use my French curve and ruler to outline the major design lines on this Oxford standard pattern so that it's clearly visible to you. So I just quickly outline all of those, and therein is the standard of our Oxford. I'll just cut it out and then we will begin to create the pattern pieces from the standard. So that's our standard, shoemakers. If you have any questions, don't forget to put them in the comment section, and if you haven't already done so, now's a good time to remind you to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and also recommend it to your friends who might be interested in shoemaking. Now, in order to create the pattern pieces, I will just cut tracing channels along the major design lines of the standard and then flip it over and use my pen to expand those tracing channels, so that when I put in my pen to trace out the various pattern pieces, it will be clearly legible. So let's go ahead and cut out the various pattern pieces. The first in line is, of course, before we cut out the pattern pieces, let's add in this curve that we forgot to add when we made the pattern, this curve around the facing, and then also do the eyelets, which is the lace holes. You draw a line indicating where you want your eyelets to fall, divide that line into two, and then further subdivide the line, the half of that line, further subdivide it, and then you'd have your characteristic 5 eyelets of your classic Oxford, and that's quite simple. Now let's cut out the pattern piece of the toe cap. So we flip a piece of cardboard into two and then trace that in. First of all, just curve that in, add about 1.5 cm and then 1 cm at the tip, and then add in the lasting allowance and cut that out. So there, ladies and gentlemen, is the toe cap or cap toe. Which is it? Let me know in the comment which you think is the correct term for it. Then we do this other side of the vamp. So this is the side that has that curve, and we will do an extra step about springing in that curve. So we will trace that out first. We will mark in the vamp line, find the middle of the vamp line, of course, and then just cut along the vamp line shy of the middle, and that will give us pivots. That will give us space by which we can pivot to straighten out that curve right there on a straight line. If you do it this way, by the end of the entire process, you will notice that your last length remains consistent. So I'll just go ahead now and secure the pivoted vamp with tape, and then I'll cut it out and then duplicate it, and we have that part of the vamp sorted out. Also, don't forget that we will have to, in order to be consistent, we will have to give it the same amount of lasting allowance and stitching allowance that we gave for the toe cap. We didn't put any stitching allowance for the toe cap, but we are going to put stitching allowance on this part. So first of all, let's duplicate it and then measure 1.5 cm of lasting allowance and add about 0.5 to 0.7 of stitching allowance to the front part there, where the toe cap will sit on this back side of the vamp. Let's quickly cut out the tongue, which is a fairly straightforward thing. I'm so sorry that my camera was out of focus. I just got consumed in the entire process and didn't realize that my camera was out of focus. Bear with me. So cutting out the tongue is a pretty straightforward process. We add about 0.7 cm of stitching allowance as well. And then all that remains will be the quarter. The quarter is pretty straightforward. It lies on a straight line, so there's no need for springing, and we only need to create one of the quarter because we can always flip it over to generate the other side of the quarter. So we'll simply trace that in, and also tracing all of our eyelets, cut it out. I forgot to add folding allowances at the top line of the quarter. I'll show you how that is when we are putting this on leather, but it's not the end of the world. I can do without it. I'll just have to make a mental note to remember to add it when I'm tracing on leather. So yeah, we add our lasting allowances and also the stitching allowance at the facing area of the quarter. And there, ladies and gentlemen, comes to the end of creating the pattern for uppers of our Oxford. In the next class, we will create the pattern for the lining, and if the video doesn't become too long, we will also go into tracing out things on leather and beginning the process of preparation of our upper leather for stitching. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope the course has been very, very fulfilling for you up until this point. I hope you learned something new and you also revise some of the old things that you know. So like I always say, God bless you. Invite your friends to like and subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next class. Peace.